recording on this, you'll get the little notice. And welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I am here with Dr. Steven Mandel, who is a pioneer in ketamine treatments for a wide variety of different conditions, depression, anxiety, PTSD. He's a founder of American Society of Ketamine Physicians, Psychotherapists, and Practitioners. He runs a clinic that has treated tens of thousands of people. I got a notice about this. This is a little different from our normal UTOKing, which is often focused on big picture theory. But I'm really, as everyone knows, I'm very interested in the concept of depression, how we think about it, how we're treating it, what are cutting edge treatments. The connection between ketamine and potential dissociation and psychedelic treatments is fascinating. In fact, Dr. Mandel's an anesthesiologist. So this is a really, really fascinating set of intersections. Dr. Mandel, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm interested in what you have to say as well.
Well,
I'm very interested in your unified theory and your thoughts about the connection between depression and suicide.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to share some of those notions. But first, let's get started with you and a little bit of your background for our audience. Can you just share a little bit of the story or as much of the story as you'd like that brought you to this, sort of pioneering way of intervening? So just in terms of a little bit of your educational background, your interests, and some perhaps key moments that landed you in this unique and cutting edge position.
Well, I grew up in the, I graduated high school in 1960.
Okay.
So I started college with the 60s. And with the Beat Generation transitioning to the Flower People.
Yep.
And with Timothy Leary holding court in Cambridge and Richard Albert, all the things that they were doing. I was pre-med, but psych major and very interested in psychology. I went on to do graduate school in clinical psychology at the University of Cincinnati.
Lovely.
When Bill Denver was chairman, it was really a very great place. Anyway, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds. 4.5 years later, I got an opportunity to go to medical school, and I took it. Everybody said, "Oh, he's going to be a psychiatrist." At that time, there was huge conflict between psychiatry and psychology, absurd kinds of binary nonsense that we are so fond of doing as humans. It's so pathetic.
We need our little categories to make sense out of the world.
Yes. It would help. Anyway, I went to medical school, became an anesthesiologist, had a nice career as an anesthesiologist, and around in the, I should mention that the Nixon administration in 1970 basically interdicted all of the exciting psychedelic medicines that I and my friends were either curious about or actually exploring. And it became felonious to even be interested.
Right.
Fast forward about 30 years and not quite 30 years, veterans began to get ketamine, which was approved by the FDA in 1970 as an anesthetic.
Okay.
As an anesthetic in the repair of their war wounds. They were getting surgery stateside for injuries suffered in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And people noticed, these guys were having surgery. People were interested in their war wounds.
Sure.
But it became apparent that some of these guys were sleeping better. Some of them were cracking jokes. Some of them didn't have to sit with their back to the wall and their eyes on the door all the time. What's going on here? It was so counterintuitive and so who would have thought of that?
Right.
Come on.
Right.
But eventually they said, geez, maybe it's the ketamine. And by 2000, a guy named Berman published a paper on this.
Okay.
And I had been very interested in mood disorders. I was a busy anesthesiologist, but I was very interested in psychology, even though I was doing anesthesia.
That's fascinating.
I also had mood and self-harm issues in my own family. And that really kind of put it high on my awareness.
Well, when it's right next to you, huh? For sure, personally.
So by 2006, a guy named Carlos Arati at the NIH took 28 patients, what are called TRD, treatment-resistant patients, patients who had not responded to everything we know. Most of them had not had ECT, but they'd had all the chemical stuff we know.
Right.
And they were still depressed. Well, he gave those people one infusion. That was the way it was done then.
Okay.
Ketamine, 0.5 milligram per kilogram over 40 minutes.
All right.
And 71% of those people were relieved of their depression. Now, I have to emphasize, these are people who had been subject to every kind of pharmacological intervention known and all of the talking therapies, and no benefit.
That's amazing.
71% had relief of their depression. Well, I was gobsmacked.
Yeah, sure.
This was like unbelievable. And I was an artist in ketamine because I was doing outpatient anesthesia where ketamine infusions were the key way to keep people asleep without instrumenting their airway.
Okay.
Ketamine is a unique medicine and unique in anesthesia because it doesn't depress respiration. It doesn't make smooth muscle flaccid.
Okay.
So people can maintain an open airway while in very deep levels of anesthesia. They also maintain their blood pressure and their cardiac output. That's why it was so great in Vietnam. It was approved in 1970 by the FDA as an anesthetic. And it just immediately became the darling of all the battlefield crowd because you could give someone a sub-anesthetic dose of ketamine and it would numb their pain and their awareness, but they could function so that they could actually participate in their own evacuation.
Wow. Okay.
Unbelievable.
Fascinating. Can you say a little bit more about ketamine as that sort of how, without getting too much into detail, we don't have a medical audience here, but just a little bit about how it works as an anesthetic?
It's a phencyclidine derivative.
Okay.
It's a kissing cousin of PCP. PCP was discovered as an anesthetic and thought to be wonderful, except it produces a delirium in which people are often combative.
Yep.
And it lasts for a very long time. And in 1962, they synthesized this cousin.
Okay.
And they did a lot of stuff in laboratories the way one does before one subjects people to it. And by 1970, the stage 3 trials had been run, and it was winner. It was a dissociative anesthetic. We didn't know the word at that time, but it produced a state where people could function, at least their physiology could function, and yet they were deeply anesthetized. So it was fabulous for the battlefield. Then this and drugs like it were interdicted, all the botanicals, all the other psychedelics. This was not, because it was at the time, it rapidly became the most widely used anesthetic on earth.
Really?
And literally for almost 3 decades, not quite 3 decades, but close, it was the single most used anesthetic in the world.
Wow.
It was given billions of times. That's why when we talk today about psychedelics, and people talk about mushrooms and MDMA and acid and peyote and mescaline, and all these are very promising agents, and they have a great role to play in behavior. It's just, we just shouldn't slip so willy-nilly from one agent to the next, even though some of them have the botanicals, thousands of years of use. We don't have any data.
Right.
We don't have any knowledge of how they function away from the shamans and away from the culture in which they're embedded. And it makes a difference.
Yeah, yeah, it does.
Context is everything.
Yeah, I certainly believe that. Very much so. Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I had no idea that it was such a prominent anesthetic in the past. That's completely new to me. Not
Still
that I'm
today,
knowledgeable
it's one
about
of the
this.
most widely used anesthetics on earth. And in fact, the World Health Organization has it on its list of 50 essential medicines that every country should include in the pharmacopoeia available to all citizens.
Wow.
That's how safe it is.
Okay.
That's how ubiquitous it is.
That's really okay. That's very powerful, and that makes good sense in terms of a very important stamp of approval given its ubiquity. Absolutely. Okay, so I'm sorry, I sort of derailed us a little bit to get back to your story. Then you noticed these results coming out, and you started to then get interested in your application to mental illness conditions.
Well, it's really great that you did do this. This is no digression at all, because one of the huge confusions among the public and clinicians is the thought you're using the same drug in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
This is the same molecule. It's being used in a totally different way and in a totally different dosage range.
Okay.
That's super important.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, right? Because
Ketamine is profoundly effective as a transformative agent for people who are depressed, for people who are suicidal, for people who have PTSD, many other indications, eating disorders, OCD, other things, but for depression, plain old simple depression, like there is such a thing. And
well, we can talk about what we think that is if we are so inclined.
That'd be fun. I'd like to do that.
Yeah,
I would like to do that. And PTSD, it's just amazing. It's just amazing. And it is the same molecule. But the route of administration, the method of administration, and the dosage range is completely distinct.
Okay.
They're not giving an anesthesia or an anesthetic. They're giving a ketamine treatment.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit then about what that treatment is. Dissociation is a word that pops up quite frequently as I heard you describe it, but where would you like to begin in terms of what does it mean as a treatment?
We don't know why people are depressed. We can talk about that, but it isn't sadness.
No.
It isn't your puppy died or your girlfriend said no.
That is true.
It's in Australia, one of the slangs for it is the black dog.
Definitely.
Has descended on me. And it's like you've got this big fluffy furry suffocating something blanketing you between you and the attractive world.
Yep.
The unattractive world is still very available.
In fact, that actually gets jacked up, right? In many ways, right? The unattractive world, the volume is up, and the attractive world, the volume is greatly muted.
It's great that you say volume. One of the things that patients sometimes talk about is their voices, the bullying, shaming,
totally
judgmental voices.
Right.
Are the volume is turned down tremendously, and they're given choice about whether to attend to it.
That is okay. That's all right. So this is very exciting. Very exciting, because let's talk a little bit. This does lead us into, let's talk about depression, and then let's talk about anything. I think I heard you mention default mode network at some point, and what that is, and the kind of structures maybe that are operative. But let's hold that for just a second, and let's come back. So if I were to ask you, and then I'll answer it, certainly ask myself, and I've asked this along. If I said, well, then it's clear depression is clearly not just sadness. Your puppy dog died, clearly. When you think about the construct, do you have a frame for how you would describe it? Like, what is depression for you?
I'm going to answer that. I want to tell you what depression is. I want to circle back and complete the question I didn't complete before.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Which is to say, I did anesthesia. I really more and more focused on how transformative ketamine was for behavior problems, And I started doing a few infusions of patients
Okay.
in the early 2000s. And in 2013, I did a bunch of them. And in 2014, I opened Ketamine Clinics of Los Angeles.
Mm-hmm.
And since that time, and we moved 3 times, we now have 5,000 feet in a big medical building with lots of people and fancy equipment. But that my focus in my life has been using ketamine to relieve depression, suicide, and PTSD since 2014. So what is depression that I'm trying to relieve? Well, I don't really know what depression is, but I know it has, for a working approach to depression, it seems to have a triad of feeling helpless, feeling hopeless, and feeling worthless. With tagging along a profound anhedonia. Nothing feels good.
Right.
Things taste like sawdust. Music is noise and annoying. A hug is a constricting, restricting thing. So that's my construct. I believe, and not everyone agrees, and we don't know who's right. I think there's often, very often, if not always, very early traumatic events. And what's a traumatic event? And a traumatic event is something that happened. And in addition to that indelible occurrence, there's the very malleable story or narrative we have around that.
Absolutely.
Ketamine appears to enable people to revisit that trauma and with the help of therapy. And it's so important this not be done recreationally because it doesn't work. Not because it's naughty or bad, because it's not going to get people where they want to go. Ketamine opens the door. And some of my patients say, oh, you put my brain through a car wash. It's great.
That is,
it gives them a new pair of glasses, but they don't know, often they don't know the choices to make without guidance.
Lovely.
So ideally, this is done as part of a care. It's not just the ketamine, it's the ketamine plus the care.
Lovely.
It takes these people who are anhedonic, who are terribly self-persecuting in awful ways,
Absolutely.
who have such horrible judgments about themselves. And it enables them to take a second look at whether there's an alternative. It gives them that alternative.
Lovely. That's a beautiful description.
It's not quick and simple. It's not magic. It takes, in our clinic, we found about 6 infusions. Zarate did 1. He had great results that lasted 3 to 5 days. And all the enthusiasts said, oh, let's do it again. And all the naysayers, and there were a lot of naysayers, and we could talk about that. Some of them really well-meaning people wanting to protect people from a novel treatment that maybe had some potential downsides. And I have to tell you, a lot of people said, oh, damn, if this works, the stuff we're selling, which is much higher priced and much less effective, has a problem.
Right. Well, we get what's called institutional inertia, and the resistances of an institution, not unlike our psychological resistances, can be, well, interesting forces to deal with for sure.
Well, but the institutional inertia has, I would say, even more reinforcement than the psychological inertia, because you have shareholders with whips.
Yeah, no doubt.
They don't care. They want to see quarter over quarter profits.
Right. There's a bottom line reality that is driving all sorts of processes at the institutional level for sure.
Not to minimize the horrible ravages of the defense mechanisms.
Right.
But this comes from outside, whether you want it or not.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me actually, let me share with you kind of my frame, okay, and then see why I'm finding your story very compelling. Okay, so the system that I constructed basically pulls out and abstracts the core function of the nervous system, okay? The core function of the nervous system is movement, in behavior in 3D space. And then ultimately what I consider it to be is an investment value system that's coordinating work effort. Okay, so essentially what the nervous system does is going to model the animal environment relationship. Okay, engage in predictive processing, pull out forms that allow it to move in particular ways toward things and again away from other things. And that's an investment value system where it's expending work effort to get return on its investment. It does this through dialectical processes like active passive. Okay, indeed, your whole parasympathetic sympathetic nervous system is embedded in that kind of dialectic. And as it engages in approach avoidance, pleasure and pain, and the various motivational and emotional structures that give us this kind of framework. If we look at the organization of our affect, the core, we get a circumplex model of affect that sees active, passive, pleasure, pain as core elements. As we move up the scale and we get into social primates, we add self-other dialectics in our primate system. So we're tracking our status and our attachment on a self-other dialectic that's also active, passive, pleasure, pain. But if it is this investment value system, then what it is doing is it's calculating a return on investment, both through a positive affect approach system, behavioral activation system, and grossly a behavioral inhibition system, which I would actually divide up into a couple of different categories, but we'll just call it this for now. And ultimately, in terms of the guidance systems of our behavioral investments, I'd actually call them minded behavioral investments. I could explain why. But ultimately, these behavioral investment structures are balanced across these issues. If you find yourself in a situation, and we use Seligman's dogs as an example, if you're a mammal, find yourself in a situation where your behavioral investment patterns are consistently blocked and frustrated, okay? Initially, there's a frustration, an activation, an anxious anger that is attempting to overcome those obstacles. However, if you cannot find a path of behavioral investment through, then eventually what happens is the system begins to shift from an expenditure, okay, to a constriction. And the constriction then pulls your behavioral activation approach system down. This is the shift into depression, where the gas pedal of approach and hedonic pleasure, both the whole dopaminergic reward structure that gets you activated and gets goals going, basically shrinks. The system phase shifts so that you pull the positive affect system down, and you then keep at or jack up the negative affect system. And so for me, depression then is a state of behavioral shutdown from the bottom, where the basic animal motivational structure is shifting and pulling and constricting the positive affect system and jacking up the negative affect system. That's what makes depression different from anxiety, which is mostly a jack up of the active avoidance system in relation. And that's the animal structure. Now, the interesting thing about us humans is we have a narrator on top of the animal structure, right? We tell a story about what the hell's going on. So our primate systems are doing this. Actually, I would say our animal systems are doing this. Our primate systems are tracking our attachments, often based on trauma and relationship issues in that world. And then fundamentally, we tell a story about who we are. And that story often is a internalized critic, which is an acronym I use for being critical and resistant and insistent and tense and irritable and controlling, okay? Which is a set of beliefs about how I need to be in the world. And what I see in depression is this animal shift that then captures this person narrator, okay? And then you create this neurotic loop, right, of feeling like shit, believing you can't do shit, doing shit, and then feeling worse about it. And it is this black dog that's gripped a hold of your soul, both at the person narrating level and at the embodiment feeling level, that I encounter when I'm with somebody. So many people are depressed, and that looping structure just dominates the psychic experience of being, and it's brutal and it's tough. And what I'm trying to do when I enter this world as a therapist is I'm going to try to create a holding environment where we can begin the process of recognizing where that loop is, cultivating acceptance and insight into the loop, and then looking for ways in which we might reverse that loop, whether basic behavioral activation principles, transformation of the narrative. But what is so hard with treatment-resistant folks is that the walls on that loop are so deep and rich and channeled that even a really good therapist often has trouble breaking in. And so I'll pause there and see what your reaction to that narrative is.
No, I'm raising my hand because this is just perfect. You know, I'm very intrigued with your model. It's new to me. I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think I'm on the same page. It's a very sophisticated and nuanced updating of old William James's fight, flight, or freeze. Mm-hmm. But it's much more nuanced.
Yeah, it's updated with a whole bunch of stuff.
The circling the drain that you're dealing with your patients and your inability to break through the walls around this horrible loop. That's where ketamine can make an enormous contribution.
That is what I heard, you know.
And ketamine, in the absence of someone to help guide the patient, the subject, the client into new good choices, may not go the way we wish it would. It could, and many people self-medicate and have transformative and very constructive experiences, but it's a crapshoot. It's not recommended. If you can have a therapist there who understands what Gregg, you just said, and can be there when that circular thinking softens, and it's not on or off.
Totally.
It's stronger or weaker, harder or softer.
Exactly.
And more or less amenable to scrutiny.
Yep.
And when you can be there to help someone to look at it,
right,
and to explore useful alternatives, that's when you can get transformation that persists way beyond the medical experience.
I love that. Let's give it a little bit of, I think we can flesh this out some. Okay. So this loop, so you have a default mode network. Okay. Basically, this is just carrying your self-relevant self-world modeling in the back of your mind, so to speak. So you have
making sense of chaos.
Yeah, making sense of chaos that's relevant for me in the past, going forward. Who am I in relationship to the world is the way I would basically describe the kind of offline default mode network. You have your tasks that you're trying to do. And then when you daydream, what your default mode network is like, hey, what was relevant for me? And they're popping in notions in relationship to this, okay? Now, if we have an instance where an individual is traumatized historically, okay, and has then a potential in which they can get eaten by the world in some way. A trauma is this unbelievable abyss. And whether you lose love, or whether you're going to have death, or whether you're going to be annihilated in terms of your status, whatever it is this, oh my God. And I don't know how to metabolize that. But this makes you vulnerable. And then if you fall into this black hole and your affective system is now basically, oh my God, all I see is threat and I see no pleasure, you can't get on the horizon. And if you have a trauma that you've defended against, now you have a narrator that the world's really dangerous, that you are potentially helpless, that the situation potentially hopeless, and that you are potentially worthless in relation. Now, if this thing's grabbing that and creating that default mode network on a weak attentional system, because actually the executive structures come down when we're doing depression, when we're in a depressed mode, and at least an orient towards pain across the stack, you are really, really in deep trouble, right? And that's the deal. That's the black dog. Okay. But now what we can do with certain like psychedelics. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in the ways in which the mind is creating these schemas, okay, schematic structures, and a stack of schematic structures. Okay. And essentially this default mode network is gripping the world. And what appears to be the case with psychedelic experiences is there's a loosening or even a melting of some level of the classic self-world grip that you're used to. Okay. So now you position yourself in the world. This is what's relevant to me. This is how I've screwed up. This is who I am. Now, any philosopher will tell you, and really Buddhist monks will tell you, that is just one perspective on the world, right? That's that frame. To have knowledge about that is simply a frame out of an infinite number of possible frames of what you could pay attention to and how you could interpret it. That's one. And you're stuck in a parasitic looping rigidly tied to that frame. Well, if
And
we
what's
can,
going on that you're stuck? Why aren't you considering that just one? Maybe interesting, maybe it's somewhat compelling, but why is it so compelling? And why aren't you considering the myriad of other ways of seeing yourself in the world?
that is a great question.
Where did you get stuck? Why isn't it just a butterfly? Ooh, nice. Next butterfly.
Totally. I think that's a great question. And what is it? And I think there are lots of different answers that drive that in relationship to this. I think there's a loosening of some aspects of the cognitive structure. I can talk a little bit about this in depression. I think much of our cognitive structure is essentially the motivational emotional structures, like a flashlight handle. It shines where you're going to do. So if the flashlight handle just shines on the negative and you have difficulty with certain kinds of task-oriented concentration, the potential for this structure, and then as you get the narrator on the same page as the feeling system, then it's like a speaker feedback loop. It's like, and it's like boom, boom. But it is super interesting as to how it is that this thing gets so deeply channeled in some people.
Yeah, but let me take now a different tack or related. It's not different at all. It's the same nucleus that we're approaching from a different angle.
Please, yes.
You mentioned soul before. And I think that's really wonderful to hear a psychologist talk about soul, because we talk about souls mostly on Sundays. And we talk about bodies in our doctor's offices, and we talk about minds in our work, those of us who work with our minds as opposed to our bodies. And the siloing of our souls or our spirits and our minds and our bodies and their isolation from one another is part of what keeps us stuck in this. I think it's part of what keeps us stuck in this loop. And what the ketamine does, and potentially other psychedelics can too. I just don't want to glibly jump over from one to the other because we know about ketamine.
I love that.
We know what harms it can cause and can't cause.
Yep.
And I think others MDMA is in the pipeline. It's probably going to be approved in mid-24 during late stage 3 trials. It's very promising. Psilocybin is quite the rage.
Yep.
I'm afraid it's partly because some very smart people have found a way to patent some of the things so that it's monetizable in a way ketamine is not.
Okay, interesting.
That's unfortunately really relevant, you know.
Very much so. Well, what's the engine? We talked about it, before.
A-track didn't prevail. It's the best stuff doesn't always win out. It depends. Anyway, the mind, the body, and the spirit really are interesting ways of isolating for study the same ball of wax. But we tend to live as though they're distinct entities.
Right.
And it really feeds that judgmental narrative.
Lovely. Yep, totally.
In
UTOK, go ahead, sorry.
In Ketamine Clinics Los Angeles, we see people all the time who can't get out of bed, who are having trouble with their personal hygiene, who can't be parents, who can't be spouses, and or who are suicidal. And this is incremental. This is not one and done. But after 6 treatments, they're transformed. Their wives, their husbands, their parents, their employees not calling in sick anymore. They're smelling the flowers instead of sneezing from them. They're they're tasting the food.
Lovely.
Like, man, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I said, the sky is just so pretty today. Now, the sky didn't change. The hamburger didn't change. The spouse didn't change. What changed? I'm going to leave that to you, Greg. But I know that it doesn't happen without this stuff.
Right.
And it doesn't happen with this stuff alone.
Well, okay. So this is super exciting. I'm so glad we're having a conversation. Right. So to me, here's what I would say that I immediately would guess that the ketamine is doing. Okay. By the way you're describing it. We talked about the keyword dissociation, right? Or briefly. And I'd like to hear maybe more about what you're suggesting here. But what I would say is that default mode network has as an implicit but very powerful schematic about what the self's identity my friend John Vervaeke and I are building the synaptic integration across all the cognitive sciences and into the biological sciences, into the social sciences, so that we can.
Did it give you a headache? Oh,
I mean, it's this is what I do. This is my little, this is my role in the world to try to create dancing between. It's a lot of stuff for sure.
It's a lot of stuff.
But I think we've actually figured out a way to really do that. Like I'll just say, so you talk about body, mind, spirit. Actually, I talk about us across behavioral frequency waves. So the ground of it, and this is like a quantum field thing, is like we're energy information at our ground. Okay. Then we're material objects. Then we're living organisms. Okay. Then I would say we're actually minded animals. We could talk about why I use that word minded animals, which basically is the sensory motor looping system, is your mindedness system. And then we're cultured persons. The cultured person is the narrating system. And then we're seeking alignment with certain things spiritually. And I can explain why from a naturalistic position we are. And that's the wisdom stack, ultimately, is an energy information, material object, living organism, minded animal, cultured person, and its organization across those layers of energy information.
And are you calling it cultured person when it's giving you feedback that you're really doing well? Maybe next time you might do something better, but you're doing well and that music sounds great. Or when that cultured person is saying, you're really a piece of shit.
Right.
And yeah, it's a nice suit, but nobody's fooled.
Right. Cultured person
Is that a cultured person too?
Yeah, they're both cultured person. Cultured person simply refers to the propositional network structure.
It's at the apex of what's running the show.
Well,
but
it's
one is a kind of a nurturing apex, and the other is kind of a punishing apex.
Totally. In fact, actually, that if you get into my approach, what I call the common core of psychotherapy delineates some of these very core elements about the critic relative to actually, I have an integrated approach to psychological mindfulness. In fact, I even built these little flashlights. It's called COM-MO. Okay. COM-MO is an integrated approach to psychological mindfulness. The MO stands for a metacognitive observer, a meta observer. Okay, step outside your subject-object relation and begin to see yourself, which is, by the way, a shift in the self-world relation, right? When you shift subject-object relation. And so instead of, I am having a really good conversation with Steven, Gregg is having a really good conversation with Steven. Even that little shift creates a subject-object frame shift. It's interesting. Calm, as opposed to negative reactivity. Calm is just a word that's sort of affectively the opposite. But ultimately, it's much more than that. It stands for curiosity. The C stands for curiosity. A stands for acceptance. L stands for loving compassion. And M stands for motivated toward valued states of being. And so what ultimately this is about, we're going to create a context where we're going to be able to have insight through curiosity and wonder. We're going to have radical acceptance across what is. We're going to have loving compassion for what the fundamental dignity of the individual, and then we'll be motivated toward valued states, and we'll be clear about what our values are, and we'll be positioned in relation. My argument is actually,
I would love to provide. I'm not going to do the design right here, right now, but if we could do half with the talking and the flashlight, and half with the talking and the flashlight and the ketamine, and do some outcome measures.
I would love that.
I think it would be very interesting.
Great. In fact, actually, I argue that this is the common core. And actually, what I argue that this should be is this should be the standard control for psychotherapy. Okay, like because actually, if you know research design and psychotherapy, one of the horribly confusing things is what is that rightful control condition? And since we don't have any generalized therapy, the supportive therapies vary tremendously as control conditions in terms of whether they're actually bona fide treatments. Some of them basically are humanistic bona fide treatments, and some of them are unbelievably lame, annoying experiences, okay, that would be just irritating and cause you to lose your mental health just if you have contact with it, right? So if that's your control, then as long as you don't irritate the hell out of your patients, you're going to get a good comparison. But COMMO is basically this common core that actually, if you look at what it is that really the core elements that cut across psychotherapy, and you're probably aware of the dodo bird finding, the general finding that psychotherapies actually more or less have very similar outcomes when you look at a broad picture view. There certainly are some differences, but I came from the cognitive behavioral tradition. I thought that was more empirically supported. My expert read on that, and actually that's not the right conclusion. The right conclusion first is there's a general common core, and then maybe there are some certain specific kinds of interventions that are particularly useful with particular kinds of issues, but that's much more, the frequency of that kind of variance is much smaller than the general finding. But I would love that.
But in all of those core things, or any of those things, for that whole spectrum, any part of that spectrum to be meaningfully transformative for patients, they have to have a certain level of readiness and a certain ability to commit. We're seeing people who are almost moribund.
Right.
Not all of them. We see some very highly functional. We see people you see on TV every night who are singing and dancing and witty as hell. But we're also seeing people who literally can't get out of bed, who have problems with really taking a shower is a big challenge for them.
Yeah, totally.
And their readiness, their ability to function, their ability to concentrate, to focus. Focus is so important.
Completely.
To hold a thought and pursue a goal more than a very fleeting interval is impaired terribly.
Absolutely.
This restores that. This
That's so exciting to me. That is so exciting to me.
Gets them to be able to focus, to concentrate.
Right.
And to have a goal and to be willing to conserve and direct and expend energy toward that goal. And
get a little behavioral activation going.
Say again?
I said that's getting behavioral activation going.
Yes. Focused and concentrated and moving in one direction instead of being dissipated, like radiating out everywhere and achieving nothing.
Exactly.
And it's just exhausting to be.
Totally.
And all of a sudden they have purpose and they have energy. And even though the world is still, if you really look at it, pretty damn daunting, they're managing to plow through.
That is.
Or not even to plow through, but to flit through, to get through the porosities in what seems like a wall.
Yep. Wow. That's great. That's really, and that makes good sense to me. In fact, when I graduated, I went to get my postdoc. I was at the University of Pennsylvania. I worked with Beck and what I was tasked with was doing
Beck?
Aaron Beck. Yeah.
Aaron, the depression.
Mr. Cognitive Psychotherapy. Yep. That guy.
Yeah, we use that. He's really great.
He passed away a little while ago.
Nice you got to know him. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I worked with him for 4 years, and I ran one of the largest ever suicide studies. People had recently a suicide attempt. So we actually brought in 180 people over the course of 2 different studies for people who had recently made a suicide attempt. And I bring that up because a good subset of those were severely, almost catatonically depressed at various times I dealt with. And when you're in that mode, the capacity to engage that system is enormously difficult from a pure therapy perspective. You just don't have much that you can grab a hold of. You can be present, you can be caring, but that is not enough. And even you can shrink the behavioral and cognitive interventions and things like that, but there's just not enough energy in the system. So I was definitely like, do you do ECT? But the idea that you could do a ketamine treatments, infusion treatments would have been an enormous benefit to me in that kind of context, for sure.
So let me throw a question at you.
Okay.
In Ketamine Clinics of Los Angeles, we see lots of suicidal patients.
Mm-hmm.
Many clinics turn them away. KCLA does not. We welcome. I mean, please don't.
Mm-hmm.
We take almost everyone, and we see depressed suicidal patients. And we have an 83% success rate in lifting their depression.
Tremendous.
We have almost a 90% success rate in relieving their suicidality. The question for you is, most patients over time have a recurrence of their depression. There are many things we can do to moderate the pace at which that occurs, but it occurs very reliably. They don't have a return of their suicidal ideation.
Wow.
They just don't. Now, go figure. How can that be so separate? That suicide does not come back. Now, you know what? Occasionally it really does, but it's like infinitesimally small.
That is a
Less than
fascinating.
1 in 100 gets suicidal again.
Wow.
And yet almost everyone, not everyone, but almost everyone needs boosters. Some 4 months, some at 8 months, some at 2 years, but almost everyone needs boosters to head off an impending return to depression. But they don't have an impending return to suicidality.
Wow, that's really fascinating.
It's amazing, and it's
amazing.
Inexplicable to me. I don't get it.
Yeah. So here's what the my and this is whatever totally off the cuff. Okay. But fundamentally, what justifies suicide? Okay. The justification of suicide is at the cognitive level is I am absolutely in misery.
ROI on suicide.
What's that?
What's your ROI on suicide?
Yeah, well, right. It's escape, obviously. It is, I'm in absolute psychache. I'm a burden on people. There's an interpersonal theory to this in relationship to this. There's the hopelessness element in relationship to a cognitive. There's the extension of pain and darkness and a fundamental sense of nihilism in relationship to the world. And essentially, the looping function is because I will be like this forever, it makes no sense for me to continue. I must escape. That if there is a sort of collapse in an interpersonal world, I'm a burden on the world, I'm a burden on myself, there's nothing but pain and it's never going to stop. And then a potential logical conclusion on a return on investment model as well, nothingness is better than this misery. I'd rather be
where would you put anger in that?
Anger comes in return in regards to the energy to destroy. Okay. So there is a fundamental resentment at oneself and at other, and of course there's a whole Freudian notion in relationship to why you would shut down potentially because of an enormous amount of frustration of a lost object or a potentiality that never gets realized or a sense of resentment against God or self or other. And those things then will increase the likelihood of violence and the increase the likelihood of a destructive impulse. So that's a part of the ingredients upon which people will then be, and then you just stack the variables like how much psychache, how much hopelessness, how much rage, how much impulse loss in terms of, you got alcoholism, what kinds of issues in relationship to, does this mean in terms of the existential crisis that individuals have about, what this will be forever. Etc.
Yes.
So, but so to me, the issue then is if ketamine gives access to a fundamental realization of a self-world shift that you believed you would never be able to, you were in a place where you're like, this self-world is inevitable. It's always the case. It will never have any possibility of escape. And you then have contact with something that actually shows you, oh my God, this is a function of the way myself was gripping the world. Right. This wasn't everything. This was a narrowing of a worldview that felt like everything, but it actually wasn't everything. And I could now see that actually I can feel this, but I have a perspective on it. So to me, my question would be cognitively whether or not what's happening to these individuals is they actually have a learning element that allows them to see, wait a minute, although I feel like shit, it is plausible to me that I will get out of this. It is plausible to me that this is a narrowing. It is plausible to me that this is a particular idiosyncratic construction that somehow I may be able to shift out of. When people are suicidal, that's not plausible. That is simply is the world and is the way the world will always be. That's why they end it, right? And so
the way you're describing it, when the blinders come back on, they know it's them wearing the blinders. It's not the world.
Exactly.
And so there is a kernel of hope or some hint of a direction in which to go. And that staves off the desire to end everything.
I mean, I'm just bullshitting a possible explanation.
Me too. Me too.
I wouldn't have necessarily said it. This is a post hoc thing, but I'm super excited that it does. And that'd be the first kind of place that I would go to begin to what seems to be a potentially credible.
It's very reliable. The depression goes away. The suicidal goes away. Most often the depression comes back, not as profound. Mm-hmm. And obviously they now have solution. But now we have a program, a 5-step program of good nutrition, a good interpersonal relationship, good sleep hygiene. Sleep hygiene is crucial. Mm-hmm. Exercise and talking therapy. And if people can do those, sleep hygiene, nutrition, exercise, intimate interpersonal relationship, it doesn't have to be physical, but peer-to-peer, close.
Yep.
And talking therapy, they may have no return of depression and no need for boosters.
That's great. Yep. No, those are... I mean, the unified theory one of the things that I did is I retranslated the core individual psychotherapies, behaviorism, emotion-focused humanistic therapy, the psychodynamic therapies, and cognitive existential narrative therapies. I cluster all those together into what are called systems of adaptation. Okay. The core system of adaptation, your habit systems. This is through your basic cyclical functions, your procedural memories, the basic embeddedness that you have reliably in the world, and the kind of basic stimulus response chaining that you engage in. Then you get the experiential system. This is your online perceptual motivation emotion system, where the emotions are and motivational structures are responding to what it is that you see. And then the emotion focus folks emphasize here. You have your primate relational attachment system, tracking status and what I call the felt sense of relational value. That's to what extent are you seen, known, and valued by important others, relative also to key traumas and what that means in terms of your internal working models. On top of all this, you have your person justification system in narrating privately to yourself and publicly, and then regulating all that. You have a psychic defensive system, basically defense mechanisms that psychodynamic people have pointed to. So what we want to do is we want to track these systems of adaptation. And what you're describing is, hey, get that habit system. I do C's for habit, SEESS, which starts with sleep. The first S is sleep. Then you get eating, exercise, activity, substance use, and sexual activity. Those are your habit structures that I absolutely look at. Then when we look at the affective system, state trait, and then the emotion system, the relationship system, whether you're seen, known, and valued, feel supported and connected, can be challenged in relational world. And then ultimately that narrator, you have a calm MO narrator you can activate, or you have this internalized hateful critic, sort of an internalized rigid introject superego, and it's transforming the critic to calm, creating a holding relational environment and healthy habits. Get people. So those.
It sounds great, and what a wonderful contribution that ketamine can make is give people the oomph, the energy, and the focus, and the concentration to pursue these paths and to move up this hierarchy. And if they can't get out of bed, or they get out of bed and just taking a shower takes most of the morning, and then they've got to brush their hair, and it's really more than they can handle. They want to lie down for a while. Right. And it takes them to people who can actually move up this hierarchy in real time in ways that, are in sync with the world and other people.
I've always said if we could do some sort of biophysiological reset that wasn't so dramatic as ECT, right? But could
Well, but ECT is not without its. It may reset in the sense that it's a reboot, but it leaves. You then not only have to reboot, you have to start reprogramming.
Yeah, no, it's a real problem. It comes with if you could have a simple, healthy, safe reboot, and that's what I heard with ketamine. It's like, oh my God, I can shift the self world, create some dissociation, reorganize, loosen some of this stuckness, and then re-energize the system. And then if you could reinforce it and get the return on investment in a zone of proximal development that you've now opened up, now, man, that is a really compelling. Compelling model.
Well, we're doing it without the wonderful system you're describing. We're doing it with ketamine plus trauma focused therapy. We're doing it with ketamine plus CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. We're doing it with many people like internal family systems.
Yep.
They find it really works very well. And I see how it would resonate very well with what you're proposing.
Yep.
Like what you're proposing is a much broader, higher level view of what's going on. But internal family systems works very nicely for people who are stuck in a kind of bullying, judgmental narrative.
Totally.
And their parts aren't playing nice.
They are not playing nice. That is exactly right. There's a destructive opponent process between the various domains and the ability to find the core self that can be present and hold those is actually, how we would define the core self may be a little different but it's absolutely, yes, I'm very well versed in internal family systems and my system basically across all of those different things, the key insights that are being offered. The cool thing, at least from a UTOK perspective, is like I can take these and turn the noise that they generate. If you try to zoom back and say, well, how do we listen to? Now you're listening to all these different songs and you blur them together and you get a lot of noise, but actually there's a zoom out and you can actually, they're actually playing different instruments that I can now put into a holistic song. And then
you can change the noise into a symphony.
Change the noise to music and into a symphony ultimately. And that's cool to be able to do for sure.
It's music to my ears.
Well, I'm happy to, and I think I have always wished that the way you're describing ketamine is it really fills a beautiful hole for me as a psychologist in many, many different treatments. That's why I was super excited to hear about it. I was like, man, I wish I could have worked with medical doctors doing this kind of thing.
It's not too late.
Too late. No, that's true. I mean, I'm now a theorist, but I still have my license, and who knows? At the level of
you mentioned substances, and ketamine is very good for helping people resolve their attachment to alcohol, to opiates, to sometimes to benzos. It's profoundly effective in changing your relationship to your substance. Now, people will say, "Well, you're giving an addictive substance to somebody who's addicted? Come on, you gotta be nuts." First of all, it isn't addictive. Ketamine is not addictive. It can be very compelling, no more so than ice cream or chocolate, or people who just love to strap on wings and jump off cliffs because it just gives them such a rush.
Right.
But it's not addictive like an opiate, like tobacco, like alcohol. Then you also mentioned, as you zoom out, you can take these individual instruments and maybe amalgamate them into good music or even a symphony. And beyond that, we have people using or wanting to use, we don't do it in our clinic. Ketamine Clinics Los Angeles focuses on depression and afflictions, people who have diagnoses. But there are many people wanting to use psychedelics, including ketamine, for performance enhancement, who are not impaired in their ability to function at all, but who are seeking to maximize every possible way to function. And whether or not that's real or illusory remains to be seen.
Fascinating.
We had a number of experiments with cocaine and with other things, and the performance enhancement was delusional. Performance actually wasn't better.
Right.
Like the drunk who thinks he can drive better.
Gotcha.
No. Or I ski better after I've had a couple of glasses of wine at lunch.
Yep.
You don't ski better, but you are more focused and relaxed, but your reaction time sucks.
Right.
Anyway, excuse me.
So listen,
Being used in performance enhancement, whether or not it actually does, but for people who are relating to me as artists and creators, they claim it loosens some of their internal structures in ways that facilitates their making novel connections. Just as the more impaired person or less effective person was telling you that they're in this endless loop and you're trying to find a way to break the circle.
Well, that's a really so when I'm doing, like, I have this little side business doing UTOK coaching, basically, coaching people through UTOK, and we hold it in two hands. And one is we're going to put a basement on any kind of struggling suffering, and that's this whole COM-MO thing. And then ultimately we're going to explore ways to release and realize your performance potential, the Dharma, your path to Dharma, which is basically doing, being, and becoming what it is that aligns with your goals, values, and potentialities, and what the society will receive, and all of that. Now, like how to do that. Now, speaking for me, actually, and people on the show know this. So I discovered that for my system, marijuana actually affords a particular kind of response in relation that I then utilize for creativity. We can debate whether this is an empirical phenomenon, but of course there's always empirical aggregate phenomenon versus N of one. And I think basically the development of the unified theory is good evidence that actually this thing, and so what it actually does for me, essentially, it's really, it actually, I can tell, I have enough knowledge of my psyche neurostructure that basically, so my default mode network is making connections throughout the week. Okay. My executive structure is basically skeptical of a lot of those associative connections. Okay. What weed does for me is it lowers the threshold for associative linkaging. Okay. Meaning that what before is like, that's a lame link. Okay. Now it gets lowered and says, oh, that's a cool link. Okay. And of course, then what you do is you get a lot of false positives. On the one hand, it's like, oh, that's really cool. And you wake up the next morning, that's kind of bullshit. Right.
So you're saying it makes you less judgmental.
It makes me less judgmental. It makes me less
production.
It makes me more open.
That's what ketamine does in a really profound way.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. It gives me a creative expressive. It makes me come up with stupider ideas on the one hand, but it makes me come up with better ideas on another.
It's less filtered.
It's just less filtered.
When we use the traditional antidepressants, it raises the floor, but it lowers the ceiling. And people are in this narrow band.
Right. Right. And so if I do once a week or twice a week, I can then pop into, and then I explode, and then I share, organize my thoughts, and then the next morning I see what diamonds I found out of the structure, and then I can bring my critical mind, and that's a variation, selection, retention, creative process, and that's a basic evolutionary process. I'll jack up variation. Okay. And then I will return to a critical selection and see it's the combination of variation selection that affords good retention. And thankfully, I've been able to build then a cumulative structure through a systematic process of variation, selection, retention to build this, flowering system. Ultimately, it's represented in a garden, a flowering system of knowledge that enables me to kind of make connections and place these different instruments and afford music from them. So I say that to say it is certainly my personal experience that there are opportunities for, certain kinds of psychedelically assisted structures to enable creativity, performance enhancement. Although again, they have to be constrained, we have to be responsible, there has to be good critical selective structures to make sure they don't come off the wheels. But if we hold that in good dialectical tension, I think that's a very, very promising way of being.
Oh, I'm very enthused about that. I definitely think there's huge, fruitful exploration to be done there. I'm a physician. I have a license. I have regulators, particularly in this area, which is still stigmatized for wrong reasons, but it is.
Mhm.
And I must treat people pursuant to a diagnosis, or I'm not going to be allowed to treat people.
Totally.
And when someone comes to me and says, I want to make better paintings, or I want my next album to sell 10 million instead of 1 million, I want that for them too. I can, as a professional physician in California, be part of that process in a way that isn't very risky for me.
Totally. No, that makes good sense. This is a fascinating philosophical set of questions also.
Yeah.
About what is healing and what is what's medicine and all this other stuff. These are UTOK's got a lot to say about that as well in an interesting way. So, yeah, no, I hear you. But it would be.
I'm my focus and my I'm not as theoretical. I'm in the minds, and my area of the minds for me, minds is a pun or a play on words.
Yeah.
But my focus, probably because of how I was and what was going on when I was a kid, is on the suffering.
Yep.
I have much more empathy for the guy who can't function than I do for the guy who is really kind of bummed that he only sold 2.5 million albums and he wanted to sell 10. And I have sympathy for both, but I want people to be husbands and fathers and be able to go to work with joy and enthusiasm.
Amen.
And when I get all those taken care of, then I'll help you sell your album.
Amen, man. I think that's a beautiful sentiment. That's certainly where my heart took me into psychotherapy, and indeed with working with some of the people who have had the hardest lives that you can imagine, and that's where I feel I want to be devoting and have devoted a lot of my clinical attention. I also am as a theorist, and I work in levels of abstraction, but nonetheless, but it's levels of abstraction toward this issue of doing cleaning up the confusions and getting to the heart of the issues with clarity, so we can make better coordinated decisions.
Yeah, and it's so peculiar how people put this stuff together. Because some of the people who really are at the very high levels of performance and functioning have had horrendous beginnings.
Sure.
Have had really traumatic, ugly, crushing first few years. Look, we're celebrating 50 years of hip hop. And I think a lot of folks never dreamed hip hop was going to be around 50 years ago. And it's been such a journey to watch this flower. And now we're seeing all these kids from the ghetto in late middle age on the radio interviewing about how their youth is and how they are now and how they've dealt with their bounty and how they've addressed their trauma in constructive ways rather than just wearing a lot of bling or spending more than the next guy or seeing how many groupies they can be with.
Right.
It's just, and then we have the people from what look like very similar neighborhoods who can't function, who are between the prison and the bottle and the needle. And it's not because they love that stuff, they can't not be there.
Right.
It's very hard to understand how one person gets to one place and one gets to the other with what looks like fairly similar stimuli.
Yeah. Well, it's a super complicated agent arena relation and then path construction with a lot of feedback loops and a lot of ambiguity, luck, error, etc. But I think we can do a lot better than we've done in sense making along those lines. We'll put it that way.
Well, if public policy took this seriously and didn't cop out that, oh, it's a matter of chance or, oh, it's the family's responsibility. It's all of our responsibility.
Totally. It's a multi-layered.
We have to bring every tool to bear that we can on seeing that people grow straight and tall.
Totally.
Every one of them.
Absolutely. Yep. No, that's and right. The UTOK argument is that we have not created the worldview, the scientific humanistic structure at the educational level, at the family, at the work level that is conducive to, or at least relative to our power, our biological and physical powers. We haven't done a great job as conducive to the flourishing of the soul, as it were, for at least for many
public
folks.
Policy can have a huge impact on that.
Totally. Now, listen, we can.
Childhood hunger went down. I don't want to get on a soapbox here, but childhood hunger went down by way over 50% when there was an increment in what aid people could get last year. And when the COVID emergency subsided and the Congress elected to not renew those grants, we resumed having childhood hunger. That's a choice. And we, if we think we're saving money, we're just kind of nuts, because we'll pay for those compromised developments in, at least $10 on the dollar.
Yeah, childhood hunger, right? Seriously, right?
Anyway, the ketamine helps. Your approach facilitates the making of good choices after ketamine has opened the door. And energize the system to be able to actually embrace and move toward those choices.
Well, I really appreciate your innovation. I appreciate your vision. I love that complimentary feels right to me. When I got the email and looked into it, I was like, God, that's the kind of thing that I wanted. So I just want to honor you. Thank you. I'm sure that many people's lives have been enormously positively impacted by your choice to be oriented in that direction, have the vision to see that, and to really implement it in the clinics and policies that you're doing. It's a beautiful thing, and I deeply thank you for it.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you a little bit and to speak to your audience. This is a pleasure. Doing this work is so gratifying to the people who do it. I hope you're getting that. I from giving ketamine in my clinic, it's just, it's a source of enormous gratification to be an instrument in other people emerging from that bleakness.
Amen. Amen. Well, that's spreading goodness, truth, and beauty. That's what we're about. Thank you so much. Deeply appreciate coming on. So
thank you.